Winterbourne Hall, December 1815. Part 1. Only for Christmas. Charlotte Ashton arrived at Winterbourne Hall beneath a snowfall thick enough to soften the entire estate into a pale, shimmering silhouette. She stepped out of the carriage with cold fingertips and a steady heart, repeating the line from the Duke's steward that had followed her for miles. "Your services will be required only for the Christmas season." The words had sounded professional when she'd first read them, formal, distant, practical. But on the long journey through the frozen countryside, that single word, only, began to sink deeper into her chest. She reminded herself that this was temporary. She would guide the children through December, ensure the Christmas fete ran smoothly, and then return home. Nothing more. Yet as the great oak doors opened, Charlotte sensed a stillness inside the estate that felt less like grandeur and more like a wound trying to heal. The foyer was breathtaking in scale, but hushed in a way that felt almost sacred. Portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes glimmering in candlelight. Servants moved with quiet steps. The air held that unmistakable heaviness of a house where joy had not stretched its limbs in a long time. Charlotte didn't need to be told what had happened here. Widowhood echoed through every corridor. Loneliness stained the silence. She didn't have more than a heartbeat to take it in before hurried footsteps broke the stillness. 3 small figures tumbled down the staircase. The oldest, a girl of 10 with long chestnut waves and perceptive eyes, paused at the bottom, studying Charlotte as if she were witnessing a storybook come to life. Sarah Merrick had a delicate confidence about her, a girl who had grown up too quickly, yet still believed in magic. Behind her stood Thomas, shy and 7, holding a wooden horse like a companion, and then Pepper, the baby of the family, ran straight toward Charlotte and wrapped her tiny arms around her skirt without hesitation. Charlotte knelt instantly, her breath catching. "Are you Pepper?" she asked softly. Pepper nodded and squeezed tighter. Sarah stepped closer, her voice gentle. "She doesn't like being alone." Thomas's voice followed. "None of us do." Charlotte felt her heart shift. She had not expected to be needed so quickly. Mrs. Weatherby approached with a polite smile. "Miss Ashton, if you'd follow me, I'll take you to your—" "We can take her," Sarah announced before the housekeeper could finish. "We know the way," Thomas added, tugging at Charlotte's hand. Pepper simply refused to let go. Charlotte allowed herself a soft laugh and followed them. The staff watched, stunned. The children had not warmed to anyone this fast since their mother died 3 years earlier. Her room was modest, warm, with a fire crackling gently. She expected the children to retreat once she'd settled her trunk. They didn't. Sarah climbed onto the bed like it belonged to her, Thomas sat cross-legged at the footboard, and little Pepper curled directly into Charlotte's lap as though she had found the place she had been searching for. They told her everything, how they rarely went outside, how Papa worried they'd catch cold, how Nurse Harding was kind but tired, how most of the staff were older, how Winterbourne Hall felt quiet all the time. Sarah asked about Charlotte's journey, whether the snow looked prettier from the carriage, whether she'd ever ridden through a village lit for Christmas. Her eyes glimmered with a longing Charlotte recognized instantly, children who wanted the world but didn't know how to say so. "You like adventures?" Thomas asked. A small smile curved on Charlotte's lips. "I do." The children's faces lit up, hope blooming so quickly it nearly broke her. She understood then. Their attachment wasn't strange, it was inevitable. Charlotte was young, warm, lively, everything Winterbourne Hall had lacked, and children always recognize where love can live. A quiet tap sounded at the door. Daniel Merrick, Duke of Winterbourne, stood in the threshold. Tall, controlled, beautiful, in a way grief had sharpened rather than softened. His dark hair was slightly mussed, and his eyes, storm grey and unreadable, moved over his children, then to Charlotte, then away as though looking too long might cost him something. "It is time for bed," he said gently, though his jaw tightened. "Miss Ashton needs her rest." The children groaned, clung, hesitated. Pepper whimpered. Charlotte kissed each small forehead, whispering, "I am not going anywhere. I'll see you in the morning." Daniel watched every second of it. And later, long after the children were tucked in, he stood in the shadowed corridor outside the nursery, listening. For the first time in 3 years, Winterbourne Hall didn't sound hollow. It sounded alive. He didn't know what to do with the part of his heart that reacted to that. And Charlotte, studying the steward's letter again, felt the weight of those words in a new way, only for Christmas. She wondered how she would keep from wanting more. 3 days later, the silence of the estate began to crack. It didn't happen with a shout or a bang, but in small, quiet fractures that let the light in. It started in the schoolroom. The room was designed for discipline. High windows, stiff-backed chairs, and a chalkboard that had been wiped clean for years. But when Charlotte sat down, she didn't take the chair at the head of the table. She sat on the rug near the hearth, her skirts pooling around her in a way that would have horrified a more traditional governess. She didn't care. Thomas was building a tower of wooden blocks on the floor, and he looked too small to be loomed over. "It needs a base," Charlotte said softly, pointing to the swaying red column. "If you put the blue ones at the bottom, it won't fall when the wind blows." Thomas froze, a block in his hand. He looked up at her, his blue eyes wide, waiting for the correction, waiting to be told to sit up straight. When the reprimand didn't come, he slowly set the red block down and slid a blue one into place. "Like that?" he whispered. "Exactly like that." A small tentative smile broke across his face. It was a tiny victory, but to Charlotte it felt massive. Behind her, Pepper was standing on the sofa, her sticky hands busy trying to braid Charlotte's hair. It pulled. It tangled. It was messy. But Charlotte didn't move away. She leaned back into the touch, letting the child work through the knots. She knew what this was. Pepper didn't care about hair. She cared about skin. She was starving for contact, for the casual, aimless intimacy of a mother. Sarah sat by the window pretending to read. She was the skeptic, the protector. She watched Charlotte with a look that was half suspicion, half desperate hope. "You're sitting on the floor," Sarah noted, her voice tight. "Nurse Harding says governesses sit in chairs." "Nurse Harding is very wise," Charlotte replied, not looking up from Thomas's tower. "But the floor is warmer, and I find it difficult to build castles from a chair." Sarah didn't reply, but 10 minutes later she slid off the window seat and sat on the edge of the rug. She didn't join them, not yet. She just sat within the orbit of the warmth, warming her hands on the fire of their small connection. Daniel stood in the hallway, hidden by the shadow of the doorframe. He had come up to check on the noise, not a disturbance, but a hum, a vibration. The house felt different today, and it unsettled him. He watched the scene through the open door and felt a sharp physical pain behind his ribs. It wasn't anger. It was jealousy, not romantic jealousy. He didn't know this woman. It was a jealousy of access. He watched Pepper lean her cheek against Charlotte's shoulder. He watched Thomas laugh at something she whispered. He saw the ease of it, the softness. When he walked into a room, the children straightened up. They became polite. They became careful. He was their father, but he was also the source of their sadness, the living reminder of the mother they had lost. He froze the air. She thawed it. "She is not family," he told himself, the thought rising like a shield. "She is a transaction. She is here to get us through December." But he didn't move. He stayed in the dark, greedy for the sight of his children looking happy, even if he wasn't the one causing it. The thaw continued the next afternoon, spilling down the stairs and into the one place Daniel thought was safe, the kitchens. The smell hit him first. Ginger, molasses, and burnt sugar. It was a scent that belonged to the past, to Christmases before the fever, before the funeral. Daniel paused in the lower corridor, his hand resting on the cold stone wall. He pushed the service door open just an inch. The kitchen was a disaster, a beautiful, flour-dusted disaster. Thomas was wearing an apron that dragged on the floor, rolling dough with the seriousness of a surgeon. Pepper was eating more icing than she was putting on the stars, and Charlotte was in the middle of it, sleeves rolled up, cheeks flushed pink from the heat of the ovens. She was wiping flour off Thomas's nose with her thumb, murmuring something that made him giggle. Daniel stared at her hands. They were capable, gentle hands. They didn't hesitate. For a terrified second, he wanted to walk in. He wanted to steal a piece of gingerbread. He wanted to feel the heat of that room against his skin. He wanted to be part of the mess. But the fear stopped him. The fear that if he stepped in, the laughter would stop. That his grief was too heavy for a room this light. He let the door click shut and walked away, his boots echoing loudly on the stones as he retreated to the silence of his study. That night, the snow fell harder, sealing the estate into a white silence. Charlotte moved through the nursery wing, extinguishing candles. The children were exhausted in the good, heavy way that comes from happiness. Thomas was asleep, clutching his wooden horse. Pepper was sprawled out, deep in dreams, but Sarah was awake. She was sitting up in bed, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the dark window. "Miss Ashton?" Charlotte paused at the door. "Yes, Sarah." "You said you're only here for Christmas." The words hung in the air, sharp and direct. The only that Charlotte had heard on her first day was now being thrown back at her. "That is what your father hired me for, yes." Sarah looked down at her hands. "Papa sends everyone away eventually. Or they leave." "I am not leaving because I want to," Charlotte said, stepping into the room. She sat on the edge of the bed, breaking the rule of distance once again. "I have a contract. It ends after the new year." "But if—" Sarah hesitated, her voice trembling. "If we were good, if we learned our French verbs and didn't track mud in the hall, would you stay?" Charlotte felt her heart crack. She reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Sarah's ear. It was the first time Sarah had allowed her to touch her. "Oh, Sarah," she whispered, "it has nothing to do with you being good. You are wonderful." "Then why?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "Why does everyone go?" Charlotte didn't have an answer that wouldn't hurt, so she did the only thing she could. She pulled Sarah into a hug. Sarah stiffened for a second, then collapsed against her, gripping Charlotte's night rail with a ferocity that spoke of years of holding herself together. Charlotte rocked her, staring at the snow whirling outside. She was failing. She was failing the one instruction that mattered: do not get attached. She was falling in love with them. And she knew, with a sinking dread, that when she had to leave in 3 weeks, it was going to destroy her. Down the hall, in the shadows, a floorboard creaked. Daniel had been walking the corridor, unable to sleep. He had heard the voices. He had stopped outside the door. He saw the embrace. He saw his daughter, who hadn't hugged him in 2 years, clinging to a woman she had known for 3 days. He leaned his head against the wall, closing his eyes tight. He should go in. He should tell the governess to return to her room. He should re-establish the boundaries of employer and employee. But he couldn't, because for the first time in 3 years, his daughter wasn't crying alone in the dark. And neither, he realized with a jolt of panic, was he. The problem with a thaw is that it is messy, and Daniel Merrick was a man who preferred the clean, sharp lines of winter. He sat in his study, the heavy oak door closed against the rest of the house, trying to review the tenant ledgers for the new year, but the sanctuary he had maintained for 3 years was failing him. It wasn't the numbers blurring his vision, it was the sound. Somewhere upstairs, a piano was being played, the notes stumbling at first, likely Thomas's small, unpracticed fingers. Before a second, steadier set of hands joined in, guiding the clumsy melody into a recognizable version of The Holly and the Ivy. Daniel gripped his quill so hard the feather bent, a physical manifestation of the ache hollowing out his chest. He should have marched up there and stopped it, should have reminded Miss Ashton that the music room was drafty or that the noise distracted the staff, but he remained frozen in his chair. It felt as though his house was being stolen from him, room by room, not by a thief, but by a joy he no longer knew how to inhabit. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loud against the floor, and walked to the window to stare at the falling snow, whispering a harsh truth to his reflection in the glass. He wasn't afraid of the governess. He was terrified of the fact that he wanted to walk up those stairs and sit on the bench beside her. He found them in the library an hour later, having intended to bypass the room entirely on his way to the kitchens, only to be arrested by the sight of them through the open doors. They were sprawled on the rug again, a breach of protocol that seemed to be Miss Ashton's preferred method of teaching, bringing the world down to their eye level. Charlotte was reading King Arthur aloud, her voice rising and falling with a dramatic flair that had Thomas and Pepper mesmerized, while Sarah sat close, her chin resting on her knees, her guard completely down. When Daniel stopped in the doorway, the spell broke instantly. The children scrambled up, dusting off their clothes and shifting from open delight to careful respect, a transformation that cut Daniel deeper than any rebellion could have. He listened to Charlotte defend the lesson, claiming she was teaching them bravery, and felt a tension between them that was tight as a pulled wire. He wanted to tell her to leave, yet simultaneously wanted to ask her to stay, confused by the way she looked at him, not with fear, but with a maddening mixture of pity and challenge that made his heart hammer a rhythm having nothing to do with exertion. The arrival of the carriage 2 days later shattered the fragile ecosystem Daniel was trying to ignore. He stood on the front steps as Lady Rosalind Merrick, the Dowager Duchess, stepped out into the snow, her sharp eyes scanning his face with the terrifying precision of a mother who knows everything. She had come early, sensing he was drowning, but her attention was quickly stolen by the children waiting in the foyer. Usually their grandmother's arrival was a formal affair, yet today Pepper broke protocol and ran to her, followed by Thomas and a smiling Sarah. Rosalind looked over their heads at Daniel, stunned to find them so awake, so alive, until Pepper pointed out the cause. Miss Ashton, standing by the stairs in a simple grey gown, dipping into a humble curtsy. Rosalind studied the governess with a quiet intensity, noting the kindness in her eyes and the unconscious way she reached out to steady Thomas before delivering a verdict that Daniel couldn't argue with. She had accomplished in 2 weeks what the family had failed to do in 3 years. When Rosalind declared that Charlotte would sit at the table for dinner, not as staff, but as the saviour of the children's spirits, Daniel felt the walls of his isolation closing in. The dinner was a quiet form of torture for Daniel, who sat at the head of the mahogany table feeling like an intruder in his own warm home. He watched his mother and Charlotte speak of books and the village, struck by the governess's wit and the way the candlelight caught the auburn flecks in her hair. It was only when Rosalind mentioned Sarah's painting that the conversation turned dangerously personal. Charlotte revealed that Sarah had painted him from the window, capturing his solitude, a comment that stripped him bare right there at the table. After dinner, when his mother had taken the children to the drawing room, Daniel found himself alone in the corridor with Charlotte, unable to let the moment pass. He stepped closer, the air between them crackling with the scent of her soap and the weight of unspoken things, and warned her not to encourage the children to believe he was human, or that he could be the father she was painting him to be. He expected her to retreat, but instead, she looked up at him with a sadness that matched his own and whispered his name. Daniel, a slip of intimacy that shocked them both. She told him he was the only one stopping the children from loving him, then fled up the stairs, leaving him standing at the bottom with his hand gripping the banister, terrified not by his grief, but by how desperately he wanted to follow her. The days that followed Lady Rosalind's arrival were a blur of evergreen and velvet, a transformation that seemed to seep into the very stonework of Winterbourne Hall. It was no longer a house holding its breath, it was a house exhaling, long and slow. Charlotte found herself swept up in a current of activity that she had not anticipated, a montage of small, vibrant moments that stitched the days together. The scent of drying oranges filling the corridors, the sound of Sarah actually laughing as she directed footmen to hang garlands higher, and the sight of Thomas sleeping by the fire with a ribbon tangled in his fingers. Charlotte stood in the centre of it all, holding a wreath Pepper had clumsily assembled, and felt a strange, terrifying sense of belonging. It was dangerous to feel this comfortable in a home that wasn't hers, to memorize the way the morning light hit the portrait of the first Duke, or to know exactly how the floorboards in the nursery creaked, but the pull was undeniable. She wasn't just watching the house wake up, she was the one shaking it by the shoulders, and every time she caught Daniel watching her from a doorway, silent, brooding, but lingering, she felt the heavy electric weight of the connection growing between them. Daniel watched the transformation from the periphery, feeling like a man standing on the edge of a frozen lake, listening to the ice crack beneath his feet. He had spent 3 years ensuring Christmas was nothing more than a date on a calendar, but he could not endure this siege of joy. He found himself wandering into the long gallery, where Charlotte was teaching the children carols, intending to silence them, only to stand paralyzed in the shadows, listening to her clear, unpretentious voice lift his children's spirits. He watched her in the great hall, lifting Thomas up to place a star on the mantel, her hands strong and sure around the boy's waist, her face glowing in the firelight. It was a domestic intimacy that felt illicit to witness, a sharp reminder of the life he had lost and the life that was stubbornly trying to regrow in its place. The guilt that usually strangled him was absent, replaced by a low, thrumming want that terrified him far more than the grief ever had. He wanted to be the one lifting Thomas. He wanted to be the one standing next to her, deciding where the ivy should go, and he wanted to step into the warm, bright frame she was creating, even if he didn't know if he deserved to be there. The tension came to a head in the library a few days later, the only room large enough to hold the sprawling piles of ribbons, cloves, and paper the children insisted on using. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting long blue shadows across the snow outside, while inside the fire roared against the chill. Daniel had entered under the pretense of finding a book, but he hadn't moved from the fireplace in 20 minutes, watching Charlotte teach Sarah how to fashion velvet rosettes on the sofa. The air in the room was thick, charged with the static of things not said. Every time Charlotte moved, the rustle of her dress seemed to echo in his ears. When Pepper, sitting at his feet, scolded him for just standing there, instead of helping with the orange pomanders, the room held its breath. Charlotte looked up, her eyes meeting his with a soft, challenging gaze that dared him to cross the invisible line he had drawn between himself and his family. Daniel hesitated, the old instinct to retreat flaring up, but looking at Thomas struggling with scissors broke his resolve. He walked over to the sofa, not sitting, that felt too intimate, but leaning over the back of it, his shoulder brushing against the fabric near Charlotte's arm. For the next hour, the Duke of Winterbourne stood bent over a sofa, sticking cloves into oranges, while his children watched him with awe, acutely aware of Charlotte just inches away. At one point, she reached out to hand him another fruit, and her fingers brushed his, a mere graze of skin against skin that sent a shock through him so potent he nearly dropped the orange. He pulled back, breath hitching, but Charlotte didn't move away. She looked at him, her pupils blown wide in the dim light, lips parted as if to speak. In that moment, the children and the decorations faded, leaving only the terrifying proximity of her and the realization that he was in deep, dangerous trouble. The children, perceptive as they were, sensed the shift and exchanged conspiratorial glances, realizing their father was no longer the impregnable fortress he had been. Sarah, emboldened by the scene, declared suddenly that they needed mistletoe for the upcoming fete, a suggestion that made Daniel straighten up and clear his throat, stepping back from the dangerous gravity of the sofa. He tried to refuse, citing the abundance of holly, but he couldn't look at Charlotte, knowing that if he did, he would confess something he wasn't ready to admit. When Charlotte quietly offered to have the gardener cut some, if it would please the children, Daniel looked at the three hopeful faces and the woman who had brought them back to life, and he crumbled. He agreed to the mistletoe with a rough voice, then turned and left the room quickly, trying to outpace the pounding of his heart, unaware that he had just agreed to the very trap that would bring his walls crashing down. Great Hall. Winterbourne Hall, December 1815. The conspiracy began in the library, whispered between the stacks of dusty genealogies, fueled by the kind of desperate, magical thinking that only children possess. Sarah had found the old journal detailing the Winterbourne kiss, a local legend claiming that the first Duke had fallen in love with his Duchess beneath a bough of mistletoe in the Great Hall, sealing the fate of the house forever. To Sarah, this wasn't just history, it was a tactical blueprint. If Papa kissed Miss Ashton a true kiss, the magic would bind them. She would become the Duchess, and she could never leave. The children kept this logic locked tight inside their heads, knowing adults would never understand. They moved through the house with a newfound secrecy, their energy shifting from chaotic to calculated. Charlotte assumed they were making gifts, never suspecting that she was not the observer of the plot, but the target. She was too busy managing the household's rising pulse and the way her own heart hammered every time she accidentally met Daniel's gaze. She was so focused on keeping her emotional walls intact that she didn't notice the trap being laid at her feet until the snare had already tightened. The trap was sprung on the evening of the fete preparations in the high-ceilinged expanse of the Great Hall. The children had enlisted a sympathetic footman to hang a massive, beribboned bunch of mistletoe from the central archway. Sarah's plan was simple. Lure the governess, summon the Duke, and let the rule of the mistletoe do the rest. Pepper called out for Charlotte, feigning a crisis with her shoe near the archway, while Thomas ran to fetch his father. Charlotte arrived first, kneeling to help Pepper, and when she heard heavy footsteps, she stood up, assuming it was the steward. Instead, she found herself face to chest with Daniel Merrick, who had rounded the corner with a speed that suggested panic, only to skid to a halt inches from her. The silence was instant. Daniel looked down at Pepper, who miraculously recovered from her foot injury and scrambled away to join her siblings, who had emerged from the shadows to form a small, expectant wall of judgment. "Is something wrong?" Daniel asked, his breath visible in the chill air, looking from Thomas to Sarah. Thomas said there was an emergency. "There is," Sarah said solemnly, pointing upward. "You are standing under the mistletoe." Daniel looked up. Charlotte looked up. The white berries gleamed innocently above them. Daniel cleared his throat, taking a step back, his expression closing off. Yes, very festive. Now, if that is all, you have to kiss her, Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. Daniel froze. Charlotte felt the heat rush to her cheeks, her hands twisting in her apron. Sarah, Charlotte said, her voice strained, that is just a game. It isn't necessary for— It is the rule, Thomas piped up, clutching his wooden horse. If you get caught, you have to kiss. Everyone knows that. Daniel looked at his children. He saw the stubborn set of Sarah's jaw and the way Pepper's lip was starting to tremble. He assumed they were just being children, sticklers for rules, obsessed with the novelty of the holiday. He didn't want a scene. He didn't want tears. He just wanted them to go to sleep. He sighed, a heavy, resigned sound. He turned to Charlotte, his eyes apologetic and distant. "Forgive me, Miss Ashton," he muttered. "It seems I am cornered." He leaned in stiffly and pressed his lips to her cheek, a quick, dry, fatherly peck that lasted less than a second. He pulled back immediately, smoothing his coat. "There, the rules are satisfied. Now, off to bed with you." "That wasn't a kiss," Pepper wailed, looking genuinely heartbroken. "That was a peck. That doesn't count." "It counts," Daniel argued, though he looked uncomfortable. "It does not," Sarah insisted, crossing her arms. She looked at him with wide, watering eyes, desperate because she knew the magic wouldn't work with a peck. "It has to be a real kiss, Papa. Please? Just one real one so it counts." The silence that stretched between them was excruciating. Charlotte looked at the floor, wishing the stones would swallow her whole. "Your Grace," she whispered, "we shouldn't." But she felt the children's gaze on her, heavy and pleading. Daniel looked at the three small faces. He saw that they were on the verge of hysterics over this silly tradition. He rubbed his temple, exhausted. He thought, "Fine. If a kiss is what it takes to get peace, I will give them the performance." "One," Daniel said, his voice rough, a warning to himself more than them. "And then bed." He stepped closer to Charlotte again. This time, he intended to make it look convincing enough to satisfy them. He placed his hands on her shoulders, steeling himself, but then he made the mistake of looking into her eyes. He saw it there, the sheer, overwhelming loneliness that mirrored his own. He saw a woman who was just as starved for touch as he was. The intent to act died in his throat. He hesitated, his breath hitching, and Charlotte didn't pull away. She just watched him, her lips slightly parted, her eyes locking onto his in a way that made the rest of the room dissolve. He lowered his head slowly. When his mouth touched hers, it wasn't the polite fiction he had planned. It was soft, hesitant, and then terrifyingly warm. Charlotte let out a small, shaky sigh against his lips, and that sound shattered his control. He forgot the children. He forgot the reason. He forgot that he was a duke and she was a governess. He deepened the kiss, his hands sliding from her shoulders to cup her face, tilting her head back to access more of her. It was a kiss of two drowning people finally finding a raft. It was desperate, slow, and aching, with 3 years of silence. For 10 heartbeats, they were lost in it, the friction of their lips the only thing tethering them to the earth. When they finally broke apart, it wasn't because they wanted to, but because the need had frightened them both. They stared at each other, chests heaving, eyes wide with shock, realizing that the children's game had just unearthed a truth they could never bury again. The separation was violent, not physical, but emotional, as if a cord tethering them together had suddenly snapped, whipping back to sting them both. Daniel pulled back as if he had been burned, stumbling a step away from her, his chest heaving and his eyes wild. The silence in the great hall was no longer the heavy, magical quiet of a spell being cast. It was the jagged, sharp silence of a glass dropping on stone. The children, who had been watching with wide, triumphant eyes, suddenly looked uncertain, sensing the shift instantly, the way their father's face had gone from soft vulnerability to a mask of terrified granite. Daniel looked at Charlotte, really looked at her, and saw his own ruin reflected in her flushed cheeks and swollen lips. He saw a future he wanted desperately, and because he wanted it, he felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of guilt toward the wife buried in the family crypt. He had enjoyed it. That was the sin. He had forgotten the dead to hold the living, and the shame of it curdled instantly into defensive anger. He barked a command for the children to go to bed, his voice a whip-crack that made Pepper burst into tears and sent Sarah scrambling to drag her siblings up the stairs, leaving Daniel alone with the woman who had just cracked his chest open. Charlotte stood alone with him, trembling, her hand hovering near her mouth as she took a tentative step forward, misreading his panic for confusion. She whispered his name, Daniel, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture, walking to the fireplace and gripping the mantel until his knuckles turned white. He couldn't look at her because if he did, he would grab her again, so he attacked instead. He told her not to speak to him, as if the kiss meant something, his voice low and cruel, fueled by his own terror. When Charlotte tried to argue that he had felt it too, he lied. He told her he felt a mistake. He told her he was a man, and she shouldn't mistake a moment of weakness or a holiday game for affection. He walked toward her, needing to hurt her so she would leave, needing to push her away before he surrendered completely. He reminded her of her contract, weaponizing her position against her. He told her she had done her job well, she had made the children smile, but she needed to remember the terms of her employment. And then he delivered the final devastating strike to ensure she would never look at him with hope again. You are the governess. You are temporary. You are not family. You are just here for Christmas. The words hung in the air, final and devastating, and Charlotte flinched as if he had physically struck her. The light in her eyes didn't just dim, it vanished, replaced by a dull, professional mask that broke Daniel's heart even as he watched it form. She slowly straightened her spine, pulling the edges of her shawl tighter around her, closing herself off from him completely. She apologized for the misunderstanding in a voice that was hollowed out, then curtsied, low, formal, and agonizingly distant, before walking past him. She didn't look back. She walked up the stairs, past the mistletoe that still hung like a mockery in the archway, and disappeared into the shadows. Daniel stood alone in the great hall, listening to the fire pop and smelling the scent of pine and cloves that was thick in the air. He had won. He had re-established the boundary. He was safe. But as he sank onto the bottom step of the staircase and buried his face in his hands, listening to the echo of his own cruelty, he realized that safety felt exactly like being dead. 2 days later, the house had died again. It wasn't a sudden death. It was a slow, suffocating grayness that settled over the rooms, despite the decorations still hanging on the walls. Charlotte became a ghost. She was efficient, polite, and invisible, teaching the lessons and taking the children for walks, but the warmth was gone. She no longer sat on the floor. She no longer laughed with that throaty, unpracticed sound. And when Daniel entered a room, she would stand, curtsy, and leave. She honored his request perfectly. She was just an employee. The children, confused and heartbroken by the failure of their magic, regressed immediately. Sarah stopped painting and spent her afternoons staring out the window with a pinched expression. Thomas put his wooden horse away. Pepper simply cried, over spilled milk, over itchy socks, over the fact that the house felt cold even when the fires were lit. Daniel moved through his own estate like a haunting, sitting in his study, staring at ledgers but seeing only Charlotte's stricken face, realizing that in protecting his heart, he had broken everything else. On the third evening, the full weight of his mistake crushed him. He passed the nursery door and heard Charlotte reading to the children, but her voice was flat, stripped of the enthusiasm and the funny voices she used to use. She read the story of the knight riding away, and when Thomas whispered that it was a bad ending, Charlotte's response was soft and devastatingly resigned. Sometimes endings are bad, Thomas. Sometimes people just leave. Daniel leaned his head against the wall outside the door, the grief rising in his throat like bile. He realized then that he hadn't just hurt her. He had repeated the very trauma his children were trying to heal from. He had abandoned them again, not by leaving, but by sending away the love they had found. He walked away down the dark corridor, the silence of the house screaming at him that he was a fool and that the Only for Christmas deadline was approaching faster than he could bear. The week leading up to Christmas should have been a crescendo of anticipation, but instead it felt like a slow, suffocating wake. Winterbourne Hall had returned to the state it was in before Charlotte arrived, but the silence was heavier now because everyone knew what the noise of happiness sounded like. Charlotte moved through the corridors like a shadow, offering Daniel a terrifyingly perfect version of what he had asked for, a governess without the woman. She was polite, efficient, and utterly unreachable. When he passed her on the stairs, she didn't look up. She simply stepped aside, her eyes fixed on the floorboards, her body angled away as if his very presence was a source of heat she could no longer endure. There were no more debates about poetry, no more flour on her nose, No more shared glances that felt like lightning. There was only the rustle of her skirts and the quiet, damning, "Your Grace," that she murmured before disappearing. Daniel found himself waiting for her to break, to yell at him, to cry, anything to prove she was still the vibrant creature he had kissed. But she didn't break. She just faded, taking the light of the house with her, leaving him alone with the victory he had fought so hard to win. The children, however, lacked her restraint, and their grief manifested as a dull, listless lethargy that terrified Daniel more than their tantrums ever had. He went to the nursery one afternoon, hoping to bridge the gap, only to find a scene that stopped him in the doorway. Thomas was sitting in the corner, his blocks untouched, staring at the wall. Pepper was asleep on the rug, thumb in her mouth, her face streaked with dried tears. Sarah was the only one moving. She was methodically tearing pages out of her sketchbook, the same book she had used to paint the garden, and feeding them into the fire. She didn't look angry. She looked resigned. When Daniel stepped forward and asked her what she was doing, she didn't even turn her head. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice flat, sounding startlingly like him. "Miss Ashton says we must focus on our lessons now. Art is a distraction." Daniel felt the words like a physical blow. He realized then that he hadn't just rejected Charlotte. He had validated every fear his children held, that love was conditional, that joy was temporary, and that anyone who brought warmth into their lives would eventually be punished for it. He tried to touch Sarah's shoulder, but she flinched away, and that small, instinctive rejection hurt more than the death of his wife, because this loss was entirely, undeniably, his own fault. Lady Rosalind watched her son's disintegration with the patience of a saint and the precision of a surgeon, waiting for the infection to rise to the surface before she cut. She found him in the library on Christmas Eve, staring into the bottom of a brandy glass while the house slept around him. She didn't knock. She simply walked in, closed the door, and sat opposite him, her silk skirts settling around her like a judge's robes. "You are quiet," she observed, her voice sharp. "The whole house is quiet. It reminds me of the funeral." Daniel flinched, looking up at her with bloodshot eyes. "Do not," he warned. "Do not what?" Rosalind challenged, leaning forward. "Do not speak the truth? You have successfully turned this house back into a mausoleum, Daniel. Congratulations. You were terrified that loving that woman would be a betrayal of your wife, so instead you have decided to betray your children." "I am protecting them," Daniel argued, though the conviction was gone from his voice. "She is leaving in January. It is better to sever the tie now than let it grow stronger." "You are a coward," his mother said softly. The word hung in the air, shocking in its bluntness. "You are not protecting them from loss. You are protecting yourself from life. You think your grief is some holy shrine that must not be touched, but it isn't. It is just fear. You are afraid that if you love her, you will have to feel everything again, the fear, the risk, the potential for pain. So you drove her away." She stood up, looking down at him with a mixture of pity and steel. "But look at your children, Daniel. Look at that woman who walks around this house looking like she has lost a limb. You haven't saved anyone. You have just ensured that when she leaves, you will be the only one to blame for the winter that follows." She left him alone in the dark, and for the first time in 3 years, Daniel let the dam break. He sat in the silence, the brandy forgotten, and forced himself to replay the kiss. Not the guilt that followed, but the moment itself, the softness, the desperate, aching need. He realized that his mother was right. He wasn't loyal, he was terrified. He was terrified because Charlotte didn't just make him forget his grief. She made him want to survive it. He looked around the empty library, at the orange pomanders drying on the mantel, at the mistletoe still hanging in the hall, and felt the crushing weight of the truth settle onto his shoulders. He loved her. He didn't just want her. He loved her. He loved the way she challenged him. He loved the way she held his children, and he loved the way she had looked at him before he broke her heart. And with that realization came a sudden, frantic panic, a sense of time running out. She was leaving. The contract said January, but looking at her hollow eyes earlier that day, he knew she wouldn't last that long. He had to fix it. He had to burn the contract. But as he stood up, heart hammering, he feared he was already too late to thaw the ice he had cast over them both. Winterbourne Hall, Christmas Eve, 1815. Charlotte packed in silence, the sound of her trunk latch clicking shut, echoing like a gunshot in the small governess's room. She wasn't supposed to leave until January, until the contract was fulfilled, but the thought of staying one more night, of standing in the back of the ballroom during the Christmas fete, watching Daniel be a duke while she remained a ghost, was a physical agony she could no longer endure. She folded the grey dress she had worn the day she arrived, smoothing the fabric with trembling hands, trying to lock the memories of the last month inside the suitcase where they belonged. She told herself she was doing this for him, that she was removing the source of his conflict, but the truth was selfish. She was leaving because every time he looked at her with those cold, walled-off eyes, it felt like he was killing the part of her that had dared to believe in miracles. She donned her cloak, the heavy wool scratching against her neck, and picked up her reticule. She had arranged for the village cart to collect her at the service entrance. She intended to slip away while the family was at breakfast, to disappear as quietly as the snow falling outside. She almost made it. She had reached the bottom of the service stairs, her trunk heavy in her hand, when the nursery door above creaked open. There was a pause, a heartbeat of silence, and then the sound of small, frantic footsteps thundering down the wood. "Miss Ashton?" It was Thomas. His voice was high, thin with panic. Charlotte froze, closing her eyes, praying for strength. But before she could turn, they were upon her. It wasn't a polite interception. It was an ambush of grief. Pepper threw herself at Charlotte's legs, sobbing with a violence that shook her entire small body. Thomas grabbed her hand, pulling at it as if he could physically anchor her to the house. But it was Sarah who broke her. The 10-year-old didn't cry. She stood on the bottom step, clutching the banister, her face pale and betrayed. "You promised," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "You said you wouldn't leave until the snow melted. You said you would stay for the fete." "I have to go, Sarah," Charlotte choked out, dropping to her knees to embrace Pepper, tears finally spilling over her own lashes. It is time. Your father needs—" "Papa doesn't know," Sarah shouted, the anger breaking through the hurt. "You're running away." The shout echoed through the stone corridor, bouncing off the walls and carrying straight into the main foyer where Daniel was crossing toward his study. He stopped. He heard the distress, not the usual bickering, but a raw, panicked sound that made his blood run cold. He didn't walk. He ran. He rounded the corner to the service hallway and skidded to a halt, the sight before him hitting him harder than a physical blow. Charlotte, in her traveling cloak, the trunk sitting by the door, his children clinging to her like she was the last raft on a sinking ship. "What is this?" Daniel demanded, his voice breathless, sounding more terrified than angry. "What are you doing?" Charlotte looked up. Her face was wet, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She stood up, disentangling herself gently from Pepper, though the child screamed and held onto her skirts. "I am leaving, Your Grace," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I am releasing you from the burden of my presence early. You said it yourself. I am not family. I am a disruption. It is better this way." "Better?" Daniel stepped forward, ignoring the way Thomas shrank back. "Better for whom? You cannot just leave. You have a contract." "Burn the contract," Charlotte cried, the outburst startling them both. "Do you think I care about the wages? I cannot stay in this house and watch you pretend that we are strangers. I cannot watch you punish these children because you are afraid of what you felt." She grabbed the handle of her trunk, her knuckles white. "I am saving you the trouble of dismissing me in January. I am going." She turned to the door, reaching for the handle. "No!" Daniel lunged forward. He didn't think. He didn't care about the staff watching from the kitchen doorway or the propriety of touching her. He grabbed her arm, spinning her around, his grip desperate. "Charlotte, stop, please." The use of her name, spoken in a voice that was ragged with fear, made her freeze. She looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. He looked wrecked. His hair was messy, his eyes wild, his chest heaving. This wasn't the Duke. This was the man who had kissed her under the mistletoe. "You cannot go," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, audible only to her and the sobbing children. I do not want you to go." "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I am useful. Because I keep them quiet." "No." He shook his head, searching for the words, but the rust was too thick, the fear still choking him. He didn't know how to say, "I love you." He only knew how to say, "I need you," because the house is dead without you, because I am dead without you. I was wrong. What I said about you not being family, I lied. Charlotte searched his face, desperate to believe him, but the wound was too deep. She saw his panic, but she also saw the shadow that still darkened his eyes, the guilt, the hesitation. She shook her head slowly, pulling her arm from his grasp. "You are not asking me to stay because you love me, Daniel," she whispered, her voice full of a heartbreaking pity. "You are asking me to stay because you are afraid to be alone again, and I cannot be your crutch. I deserve to be chosen, not just needed." She opened the door. The cold wind swirled in, carrying snow onto the stone floor. "Charlotte." He reached for her again, but she stepped out into the grey light. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said softly. She closed the door. The click of the latch was final. Daniel stood there, his hand still reaching out into the empty air. Behind him, Pepper fell to the floor in a fresh wave of wails, and Sarah looked at her father with a gaze that was no longer angry, just disappointed. "You let her go," Sarah whispered. "You let the miracle go." Daniel stared at the wood of the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had let her walk out. He had let the fear win. And as the sound of the cart's wheels crunching on the snow faded into the distance, he realized that he wasn't just alone. He was destroyed. The road to Winterbourne Village, Christmas Eve, 1815. The silence that followed the closing of the heavy oak door was not peaceful. It was violent. It rang in Daniel's ears, louder than the screams of his children, louder than the wind battering the stone walls. He stood frozen in the foyer, his hand still half raised toward the wood, staring at the grain as if he could will Charlotte back through sheer force of regret. Behind him, the sobbing had stopped, replaced by a terrifying, judgmental quiet. He turned slowly to see Sarah standing at the foot of the stairs. She wasn't crying anymore. She looked older, her small face hardened by a disappointment that cut him deeper than any tantrums could. "She is going to the coaching inn," Sarah said, her voice devoid of emotion. "The London mail leaves at noon. If you ride, you can catch her. If you stay—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. She turned her back on him and walked up the stairs, taking the last of the light with her. Daniel didn't think. The paralysis that had gripped him for 3 years, the fear that had kept him trapped in his study, trapped in his grief, trapped in the safety of isolation, shattered. He didn't call for a groom. He didn't grab a coat. He burst out the front door into the biting cold, sprinting toward the stables with a desperation that burned his lungs. He saddled his black gelding himself, his fingers fumbling with the buckles, his breath coming in sharp, white clouds. "I am a coward," he thought, the rhythm of the words matching the pounding of his heart. "I let her leave because I was too scared to admit that I'm already alive." He swung onto the horse and tore out of the stable yard, galloping down the snow-covered drive, the hooves kicking up clumps of ice. He wasn't chasing a governess. He was chasing the only chance he had left to save his family from the winter he had created. He found her at the village inn, a small, timber-framed building that smelled of damp wool and stale ale. She was sitting on a bench near the fire, her trunk at her feet, looking small and devastatingly composed. She was staring at the flames, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale and tracked with dried tears. When the door banged open, letting in a swirl of snow and freezing air, she didn't look up initially. It was only when the silence of the room shifted, when the other patrons stopped talking and stared at the disheveled, breathless Duke standing in the doorway, that she slowly turned her head. Her eyes widened. She stood up, her hand going to her throat, her expression one of pure heartbreak rather than anger. She looked like she wanted to disappear. Daniel crossed the room in 3 long strides, ignoring the whispers of the villagers, and stopped inches from her. He looked wrecked, hair windblown, shirt damp with snow, eyes wild and pleading. "You cannot go," he rasped, his voice rough, stripped of all its noble polish. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice shaking. She looked around nervously at the staring crowd, shrinking in on herself. "Please, do not be here. I have my ticket. It is done." "It is not done," he said, shaking his head frantically, reaching for her hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "Nothing is done. I am not letting you get on that coach." "Why?" Charlotte asked, a tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't pull away, but she didn't hold on either. She looked at him with a soft, crushing defeat. Because the children are crying? Because you need someone to manage the house? She shook her head slowly, looking at her boots. I cannot do it, Daniel. I am not strong enough to be near you and be nothing to you. It hurts too much. I know, Daniel said, seizing her hand now with both of his, pulling her gently toward the door, away from the prying eyes, into the small, empty vestibule where the air was cold but private. He backed her against the wall, shielding her with his body. I know I have hurt you, but you have to listen to me. He took a breath, his chest heaving, and then he let the walls down completely. I didn't send you away because you weren't family, Charlotte. I sent you away because you were becoming the only thing that mattered. Charlotte looked up, her breath hitching. What? I was terrified, he confessed, the words tumbling out, raw and bleeding. When I kissed you, God, when I kissed you, I didn't feel guilt, I didn't feel grief. I felt happy, and that scared me more than anything. I thought if I loved you, I was betraying her. I thought if I let myself be happy, I would forget the pain. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes squeezing shut. But these last 2 days, the silence, it wasn't honoring the dead. It was killing the living. I realized I would rather be haunted by my grief for 1,000 years than spend one more day without you in my house. He pulled back enough to look at her, his blue eyes searching hers with a vulnerability that broke her heart. I am a broken man, Charlotte. I come with 3 children who are desperate and a house that is too big and too cold. I have nothing to offer you but a heart that is trying to learn how to beat again. But it beats for you. It has beaten for you since the moment you sat on that rug and built a castle for my son. Charlotte stood trembling, tears spilling silently over her cheeks. She wanted to fall into him. She wanted to believe him. But the wound he had inflicted in the great hall was deep, and her heart was too tender to simply mend with words. She reached up and touched his face, her thumb brushing the rough stubble of his jaw, her touch light and hesitant. You sent me away, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You told me I wasn't family. I am afraid, Daniel. I am afraid if I come back you will remember your fear tomorrow and send me away again, and I don't think I could survive it a second time. I won't, he choked out, leaning into her hand. I swear to you. I want to believe you, she said softly, pulling her hand back, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold her own pieces together. But I cannot go back to the hall right now. I cannot walk back into that room where you looked at me with such coldness. Not tonight. Then don't, Daniel said, desperation edging his voice. Stay here. Just do not get on the coach to London. Give me until tomorrow. Give me Christmas. Charlotte looked at him, seeing the panic in his eyes, but also the love. She took a shuddering breath and nodded, a small, fragile movement. I will not get on the coach, she whispered. I will stay at the inn tonight. And tomorrow? Daniel asked, terrified. Tomorrow is Christmas, she said simply, her eyes filled with a sad, quiet hope. If you really mean what you say, then perhaps miracles are allowed. She turned and walked back into the main room of the inn, unable to look at him any longer because she was crying too hard. Daniel watched her go, his heart aching with a mixture of relief and terror. She hadn't said she would come back. She had only promised not to leave yet. He leaned his head back against the rough timber wall and closed his eyes, listening to the wind howl outside, knowing that he had stopped her from leaving, but he hadn't won her back yet. He still had to prove he was brave enough to keep her. Winterbourne Hall, Christmas Day, 1815. Christmas morning broke over Winterbourne Hall with a sky the colour of bruised slate, the sun struggling to pierce through the heavy grey clouds. Inside, the house was quiet, but it was not the dead silence of the previous week. It was a held breath, a suspended moment of terrifying hope. Daniel stood in the foyer, staring at the front door as if he could will it to open, his hand clutching a scrap of paper that Sarah had shoved into his palm at breakfast. It wasn't a gift list. It was a single sentence, written in her careful, slanted script. Bring her home, Papa, or the cold will never leave. He read it again, his thumb tracing the ink, feeling the weight of his daughter's ultimatum settle into his bones. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every mistake, every cruel word he had spoken in fear, knowing that today he had to stand in front of the entire village and be a duke, even though he felt like a beggar. He had sent the carriage for Charlotte an hour ago with a note that simply said, "I am waiting," but the carriage had returned empty. The coachman said Miss Ashton would come in her own time, or not at all. That uncertainty was a torture Daniel knew he deserved, so he put on his coat, walked out into the biting wind, and went to light the fires for the fete, praying that the warmth would be enough to draw her back. By twilight, the estate grounds had transformed into a world of flickering amber and shadow. The village fete was in full swing, a tradition that had survived wars and winters, fueled by the sheer stubbornness of the community to find light in the darkness. Huge bonfires roared in the center of the clearing, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky to mix with the falling snow. Torches dipped in pitch lined the pathways, casting a warm, unstable glow over the faces of the villagers who drank cider, laughed, and huddled together against the chill. Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, his children clustered around his legs like a small, anxious guard. They weren't playing. They were watching the road. Pepper held Daniel's hand so tight her fingers were white. Sarah stood with her chin high, scanning every carriage, every figure that emerged from the dark. They looked like a family waiting for a ship to come in, terrifyingly fragile in their hope. Lady Rosalind stood beside her son, her face unreadable, though she reached out and squeezed his arm, a silent signal to breathe. And then, the miracle happened. It didn't come with trumpets or fanfare. It came quietly, just as she had. A small village cart pulled up to the edge of the torchlight, and a figure stepped down, wrapped in a simple wool cloak. Charlotte stood there on the perimeter of the celebration, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek and the hesitation in her posture. She looked at the crowd, then at the hall looming in the background, and finally her eyes found Daniel. The noise of the fete seemed to drop away for him. He didn't wait for her to come to him. He wouldn't make her walk that distance alone. He released Pepper's hand, whispered, "Stay," and walked toward her. He moved through the crowd, past the tenants who bowed and curtsied, past the roaring fire, his eyes locked on her face. When he reached her, he didn't stop at a polite distance. He stepped into her space, shielding her from the wind, his body radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the bonfires. "You came," he breathed, his voice rough with relief. "I didn't want to," Charlotte admitted, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the coldness she feared. "I was afraid." "I know," Daniel said, reaching out to take her gloved hands in his. He held them against his chest, right over his heart, so she could feel the frantic rhythm of it. "I am afraid too. I am afraid I will not be enough for you. I am afraid the ghosts will always be in the corners, but I am more afraid of a life without you in it." He lowered his voice, oblivious to the villagers who had quietly turned to watch the Duke and the governess. "You said you were afraid I would send you away again, so I am telling you now, in front of everyone, I am claiming you, Charlotte, not as a governess, not for Christmas. I am asking you to be the heart of this house. I am asking you to be the mother my children need, and the wife I never thought I would deserve to have again." Charlotte stared at him, tears spilling over her lashes, catching the reflection of the fire. She saw the truth in his eyes, the raw, unguarded need. She saw the children standing a few yards away, their faces lit with a desperate hope. She saw Sarah take a step forward, unable to wait any longer. "You are family," Daniel whispered, rewriting the words that had broken them. "You are the only family that matters now." A sob broke from Charlotte's throat, and she nodded. It was a small movement, but it shattered the last of the ice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Daniel." He didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of lavender and cold air, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in the world. The children didn't wait for an invitation. They broke rank and ran, colliding with them in a tangle of arms and wool and tearful laughter. Pepper buried her face in Charlotte's skirts, Thomas hugged her waist, and Sarah, the brave architect of their happiness, wrapped her arms around them both. Daniel looked over Charlotte's head at his mother, who was smiling through her own tears, and then he looked down at the woman in his arms. He kissed her, not a desperate kiss, and not a performative one, but a slow, tender seal of a promise kept. The snow began to fall harder, dusting their shoulders in white, but for the first time in 3 years, the cold didn't matter. Winterbourne Hall was no longer a frozen fortress. It was a home, and the fire burning in the central hill would never go out.